All right, guys, Murph's here, and today we're going to talk about this. A P08 Luger chambered in 9mm. Now, in order to talk about this, we're going to have to talk about a little bit of history, and I'm actually really excited to bring this gun to you guys because I absolutely love this little handgun. In the late 1800s, the Swiss put out a request to fulfill a contract for a new semi-automatic pistol for their military. Now, at this time, semi-automatic handguns were an emerging trend in the military industry and were actually generating a lot of interest initially for cavalry, but as more and more militaries were trying to just go to one standardized arm, you would start to see these options filter into other branches of the militaries, the infantry, the Navy, and all that kind of stuff. Now, what's really interesting to me is that in the late 1800s, early 1900s, we haven't really figured out exactly what a semi-automatic handgun is going to look like, what the formula is in order to be able to have a successful, reliable, ergonomic semi-automatic handgun is. So we wind up with a lot of very different and very interesting designs and mechanisms. This is most definitely indicative of the above. Now, a gentleman named Georg Luger would take the design of Hugo Borchardt, the Borchardt C93 pistol, and would refine it, make it a little bit lighter, a little bit more compact at the request of the Swiss. And he would eventually put together the model 1900 Luger, which would be chambered in 30 Luger. This handgun, with some additional minor adjustments, would go on to be adopted by the Swiss military and would continue in service up until the 1950s, well, until about 1949, actually. Now, other people would take notice of this Luger pistol, and they would start putting in some requests as well. The German Navy in 1906 would adopt the Luger pistol, still chambered in 30 Luger. And the German Army would take notice in 1908, adopting the Luger pistol in 9mm. Eventually, the Navy would switch over as well. Now, in 1907, two examples of the Luger chambered in 45 ACP would be sent to the Americas, specifically the United States of America, to compete for the new handgun adoption there, up against the 1911 and the Savage and a couple of other designs as well. Now, unfortunately, it would wind up losing out, and now those pistols are quite valuable. Now, the P08 Luger would wind up being the primary issue arm of the German army going into World War I. It would also be issued in Portugal, the Netherlands, as well as a lot of South American countries. Post-World War I, military adoption or military use of the Luger would be limited to a set number of pistols. However, there would still be commercial sales of the Luger pistol, which would have their own distinctive markings and all that kind of stuff. Going into the 1930s, the Luger in German military service would be replaced by the P38. However, production of the P38 would not get underway in time before World War II started to preclude the military use of the P08 Luger, which would continue in full-on production until 1942, with guns still being assembled into 1944. And then post-World War II would still see service with the West German military forces and police. Now, of course, these handguns would be captured en masse by the Russians and would be distributed to lots of their proxy wars all throughout the Cold War. And this gun has captured the imagination of many movies and comic books and TV shows and video games and all that kind of stuff. You can see it all over the place. It is very iconic in its layout and in the history that it involves. All right, that's pretty much history. Why don't we go ahead and get into features? This is a 3.9-inch barrel. However, there would be some longer barrels in like 4 3/4, all the way out to 8 inches in what's still considered to be a pistol. And that would specifically be the artillery Luger, which had an 8-inch barrel with adjustable rear sights and the ability to be able to attach a stock that also doubled as a holster. I really think those are super neat, and I would absolutely love to add one to the collection, but they are very valuable. Now, we can see here we have a tapered blade type front sight, which has some serrations on the portion facing the shooter so that it can break up glare, which I've never really noticed this to be an issue with pistol sights, but I guess for sure it will not be with this particular arrangement. This is dovetailed into the barrel here. Now, coming back to our action, this is a toggle lock system. As we can see here, it kind of moves like somebody's knee. And this is very interesting because not very many guns have been made with a toggle lock style system. So the idea here is that upon firing, the barrel will recoil back slightly, and then the toggle will run against the natural cam built into the receiver of the firearm in order to cycle up. With that, ejection is straight up and down, which makes a lot of sense because we don't exactly have anything pushing it off to the side here like we would have what is now considered to be a traditional slide. Traditional does not exist yet at this point in firearms development. When this handgun was initially designed, there were not very many competing designs out on the market in comparison to revolvers. Now, our extractor also works as a loaded chamber indicator, which can be kind of surprising to some people that even back in the early 1900s, we were still concerned about being able to display to somebody whether or not their chamber was loaded. Now, on top of our toggle here, we have the markings for DWM, or Deutsche Waffen Munitions. Deutsche Waffen Munitions, or Munitionwerks, depending on where it is that you look, which was the primary manufacturer of Luger pistols going into the 1920s until they were bought out by Mauser. Now we can see here on the actual grasping portion of our toggle, we have excellent checkering, which makes it very easy to be able to grip this toggle. Our rear sight is an incredibly small notch set into the toggle. These are not very good sights. We'll talk about this more once we get into shooting. We have a lanyard loop attached to the rear of the receiver here, very common for firearms, military variety in this time. Our safety is located at the rear of the receiver, down for safe, up for fire. You can actually see a positive block that comes across the sear. This is a striker-fired pistol. We'll talk about that more here in a second. Now, the safety, when it comes to drawing this out, is not too difficult to access, but you do have to readjust your grip in order to do so, which is not my favorite for safety, but this isn't exactly a modern fighting firearm either. All right, let's go ahead and talk about our trigger real quick. This is a striker-fired trigger, like I mentioned before. We do have a little bit of pre-travel before we hit the wall, and then it's a fairly heavy path to get through the wall, and our release is kind of indistinct. Now our reset is quite far out, and it's that same, it's pretty much, reset's pretty much all the way out, and then it's that same long travel to the wall before we get to that kind of spongy break. This is definitely indicative of like all the worst aspects of striker-fired triggers, if I'm being completely honest. Which is not surprising when you consider that this is an early pistol design, so we haven't exactly figured out match-grade triggers on semi-autos yet. If you look at some manufacturers today, they still haven't figured out match-grade striker-fired triggers in production handguns. Now, interestingly enough, for European design, our magazine release is at the corner of the trigger guard, which is kind of surprising. For the most part, a lot of designs, especially for this time period coming out of Europe, have some type of heel release, which is important for the methodology of the time, which was these magazines came with the gun. They were serialized to the gun. So there was an expectation that you were going to retain that magazine. You weren't going out there with like a belt full of magazines and doing, super crazy mag change drills and all that kind of stuff. This was a last-ditch weapon that you shot advancing. If your trench was getting overrun or something like that, you shot guys off of you with, and then you retreated to somewhere else where you had a higher casualty producing weapon system and more personnel available. This is an officer's gun, not some sort of like super cool tactical fighting handgun. Our grips are checkered walnut, and we have this very distinctive grip angle of this pistol, which, though you can establish a two-handed firing grip with it, this is a very naturally pointing firearm for a one-handed type grip, which was very indicative of shooting practices for the time, that you would take up a rather gentlemanly pose and calmly aim down your sights in order to be able to engage your targets. Now, on the 1900 Lugers adopted by the Swiss and others, there would have been a grip safety. We do not see that here. In addition to that, we do not have any type of manual slide release. The slide locks back on the last round fired, and then you have to remove the magazine in order to be able to drop the toggle. I guess it's a slide. Toggle is what we're dealing with here. Our standard magazine would hold 8 rounds. There are a lot of magazines that you'll find out there now that claim they are 7-round magazines. a lot of aftermarket magazines, which are also meant to work with any of the 30 caliber Luger M1900s or 1900 Lugers that you find out there, which there are occasional mass importation, there weren't that many of those guns produced in comparison to the millions of Lugers that were produced, but there are large shipments of those guns that come in from time to time. Now, something that's interesting about this pistol is that we do have a stock attachment point here at the butt of the gun. We'll talk about that more here in just a minute. Actually, you know what? Let's just go ahead and talk about that now. This is not a World War II Luger. I can tell that by the markings and the lack of like a production date on the receiver ring and stuff like that. This is a 1920s commercial Luger. And I suspect somewhere between 1920 and 1922 that this handgun was produced, making this about 100 years old, if not a little bit over, which is incredibly interesting. We'll get into that more here in a second. But with it being a 1920s commercial gun, we have a gun that is basically made up of post-World War I assembled parts. So there was a mass production of these parts. There was a whole bunch of, pretty much run over as the war ended. And then DWM was assembling pistols based off of those production overruns, which was still pretty lucrative. These were primarily imported in the United States as well as some other neighboring countries to Germany. All right, so that's features. How does it shoot? So I've been shooting this handgun for a very long time, and I can tell you, accuracy-wise, it is okay. It is not the most accurate handgun that I've ever shot, but it can definitely still put together the hits, especially if you take into consideration some of its kind of odd ergonomics and all that kind of stuff. So I've noticed that it has a tendency to print a little high. I think these sights are calibrated for a little bit further shooting than what we would normally see today. However, it does point very naturally and very quickly, and it is very easy to be able to work around this handgun. I really enjoy shooting this gun. Now, a couple other things with the shooting dynamics on this pistol. First off, these sights are very small, very indiscriminate. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. So it can be kind of difficult to line them up quickly, but it can be done as long as you get consistent in your presentation, just like any other handgun. Now, during cycling, you've got all this mass that's going up, and this does two things that work against you. One, it causes the handgun to be a lot more flippy, which makes shot recovery a little bit more difficult. And then two, it also obscures your sight picture during firing, so it makes it difficult to read impacts, which is kind of obnoxious all on its own. Ready? Now, reliability-wise, this handgun jams a lot. Now, some people say that's not surprising for something that's assembled from a whole bunch of different parts, but keep in mind that the machining and tooling on this handgun is absolutely top-notch. It is most definitely indicative of turn-of-the-century manufacturing techniques, to where it is just so highly polished and well-fit. There's no shake, there's no rattle, there's no wiggle on this handgun. So, just because they were assembled from leftover parts doesn't mean that they still weren't properly assembled. I chalk this up more to this is a 100-year-old gun, and you know what? It's fine if it malfunctions, on every magazine. I don't care. It's not a defensive firearm for me. This is a pure enjoyment of shooting. Now, we can also see that this being the magazine that came with the gun, at least when it came to me, we have a little bit of damage to the feed lips. That for sure isn't helping. I do have a couple of aftermarket magazines that I've been running through this gun, and I do have pretty consistent malfunctions with those as well. So I think at a certain point, you just got to accept that, yeah, this is going to jam. But it's a beautiful part of functional history that it's completely fine that you have to work on some malfunction clearance every once in a while in order to be able to appreciate what this handgun is. All right, guys, that's shooting. What are my recommendations when it comes to this handgun? Would I recommend this for a duty use, a home defense use, or a CCW type use? Absolutely not. Not in a million years. First off, you're not going to be able to find any type of current holster. You're going to be stuck with the older style World War II holsters that are just not conducive to modern combat techniques. There's no opportunity to be able to mount a light on this, and I wouldn't do it even if there was. I wouldn't attempt to make there be a light rail on it. And then its overall reliability and parts availability and stuff like that really put this out of being a hard use handgun. I 100% would not recommend this for that use. Neither would I recommend it for competition use unless you're just kind of wanting to bring it out for a giggle factor. Maybe you're shooting some type of memorial shoot, World War II, D-Day or something like that, and you've grabbed up a Mauser 98K and your P08 Luger, and that's what you're going to take to the competition. All right, man, all the more power to you. I 100% recommend this for a joy of ownership type gun. This is something that is a must-have in a collection if you're of the means, because there is very few firearms as iconic as a Luger. Which is getting to the next point. What is this gun to me? That is exactly what this gun is. This is a piece of history that I get to take out and I get to enjoy. I get to shoot. I get to display to others. It's one of the pivotal talking points in my gun collection. If people come into my gun room, this gun is coming out so that we can ooh and ah over the amazing turn of the last century ergonomics and machining and all that type of stuff that goes into appreciating this handgun. Now, originally when this gun was purchased by the owner prior to me, they were convinced that this was a World War II bringback. Based on its markings, the fact that there's not a Nazi eagle on it anywhere, let alone German acceptance markings into the military, even prior to the Nazis, this is definitely a commercial import. Probably never saw a day of fighting as far as I can tell. Now, could it have been picked up somewhere in Europe and then carried by a German soldier and then captured from them by an American soldier? Sure, I guess that's a possibility. However, I also have no capture papers, so I have no way to be able to prove that story. So with that being the case, I'm pretty convinced that this is just a 1920s factory rework, and that does nothing to take away the old school cool of this particular handgun, the historical importance of what this is when it comes to the development of combat handguns in the world. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular handgun. I hope you guys found this interesting, and that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.